Fellas, this week there's been a lot of discussion on Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler. Now, about that fight is that it's a non-title fight pay-per-view main event and one of the biggest you can make in the UFC, and it's got me thinking, what is theoretically the biggest non-title fight pay-per-view main event you could make in every single UFC weight class? So if you had to go for every weight class, make a pay-per-view, not just a fight night, but a pay-per-view main event that couldn't include a belt. And I'm talking undisputed belts, BMF belts, interim belts, every type of belt in the UFC. It can't be for a belt, but it has to main event a pay-per-view, and it has to be in every weight class. What would I choose and which fighters would I choose? So I'm going to be going through each weight class from heavyweight to flyweight and picking two fighters that I think would be eligible to do this. And yeah, just let me know if you agree and if, you know, you do switch any fighters around. But for the heavyweight division, now, obviously, we can't include John Jones or Tom Aspinall because they're both holding belts. So I think the first fighter I would include is Ciryl Gane. I mean, a statistic about Ciryl Gane is that I'm pretty sure he's headlined every single card that he's been on since 2020 when he's faced Junior Dos Santos. Whether it be a pay-per-view or a fight night, Ciryl Gane has been the main event every single time since he fought Junior Dos Santos, which definitely means that he's eligible to be main event. On top of that, he's quite well known to the casuals because he has fought John Jones, he's fought Francis Ngannou, and he's had the big fights in the heavyweight division, and he's got a big French market as well, so I think it has to include Ciryl Gane, and he is one of the biggest stars in the heavyweight division. Even though he hasn't won a belt or anything, he is definitely a big star, and I would matchmake him against, now originally I was going to matchmake him against Stipe, but I just don't think anyone really cares for Stipe in 2024, so instead I've done Ciryl Gane versus the winner of Sergey Pavlovich and Volkov. Now if Pavlovich wins, I mean, first of all, he's got 6 first round knockouts in a row that he's used to, and if he is able to get a win over Volkov, Pavlovich versus Gane would be one of the most intriguing matchups you could make in the UFC. You've got a dangerous striker in Pavlovich versus a technical striker in Gane. It's such a fantasy matchup that I just want to see. And honestly, I wouldn't be mad if that was the main event at pay-per-view. And if Volkov wins, I guess Volkov isn't a massive star, but I guess you can go with the whole narrative that they've had a fight before. So it's like a rematch between Volkov and Gane. Volkov's on a 4-fight winning streak if he's able to beat Pavlovich. 3 of them coming by way of finish, and maybe 4 if he finishes Pavlovich as well. So I feel like Ciryl Gane versus the winner of Pavlovich versus Volkov. And then you can also call that like a #1 contender fight as well. Winner gets to fight Aspinall. I would not mind that at all. So for Ciryl Gane, I would do him versus Pavlovich and Volkov, and I think that is probably the biggest non-title fight pay-per-view main event you could do in the heavyweight division. Maybe it would have to be Ciryl Gane versus Stipe, but again, does anyone really care about Stipe in 2024? Maybe this would have been the biggest fight if you'd have asked me this 3 years ago, but we're in a different time now. We're not in 2020 and 2019 where Stipe is the heavyweight champion. So Ciryl Gane versus the winner of Pavlovich versus Volkov, that would be my answer for the heavyweight division, because who else is there? Curtis Blades, Jelton Almeida, they ain't main eventing no pay-per-view. So yeah, Gane versus the winner of Pavlovich and Volkov. Now the light heavyweight division, it also has the same issue where you take away Alex Pereira and there isn't really much big stars in that division. So for the first fighter, I think we've got to include Jamal Hill. He's a former champion. He's just main evented one of the biggest pay-per-views of all time in UFC 300. He's a trash talker. He's promotable. He's going to promote the fight. So I think it's got to include Jamal Hill just because he has done that. And whether you love him or you hate him, you've got to admit he is definitely one of the bigger stars in the light heavyweight division, especially after UFC 300 when he went viral for getting KO'd in the first round. And I would match him up against Yuri Prochazka. Jamal Hill versus Yuri is one of those fights that I've kind of been waiting for to happen for like the past few years. I wanted this to happen when Yuri was the champion. I wanted this to happen when Hill was the champion. And I still want it to happen now that neither of them are the champion. I think it's a fantasy matchup between two impressive strikers. I would love to see this fight. So I would say that Yuri versus Hill is probably the biggest that you can make. They're both big stars, like I said. And I think that would be a really big fight. I mean, who else really is there? Magomed Ankalaev versus Hill. You know, Jan Blachowicz. I just don't think there's anyone that can really compare to Yuri in terms of excitement for a pay-per-view main event. So I would go Yuri versus Jamal Hill for the pay-per-view main event if I had to choose it in the light heavyweight division. Now, middleweight, this one's pretty easy. Adesanya, obviously one of the biggest stars in UFC history, full stop. So it would have to include Adesanya, and I would do Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev. Adesanya versus Chimaev, I'm going to go as far to say this is arguably the biggest fight you can make in the UFC that doesn't involve a belt, that also doesn't involve Conor McGregor. Adesanya versus Chimaev would be absolutely huge. They're two big stars. It's a classic wrestler versus a striker, but at the highest level. You've got Chimaev, who's dangerous early on, and Adesanya, who could be dangerous in the championship rounds. The build-up to this would be absolutely amazing. And I just hope we see this fight. I don't care if it's for the middleweight belt or not. Adesanya versus Chimaev would be absolutely huge. And this could definitely 100% go down as a non-title fight pay-per-view main event. This would be absolutely massive. And I think this is the obvious answer for the middleweight division. As long as it involves Adesanya, you could, I guess you could chuck maybe Strickland in there as well, because Strickland's a big star. But I think Chimaev versus Adesanya would definitely get the world talking about this fight. So for the middleweight division, I honestly think Chimaev versus Adesanya is probably the biggest fight you can make in that specific division. And then the welterweight division, the one fight that I've chosen is Colby Covington. Now, he has main evented a non-title fight pay-per-view before when he fought Masvidal, and the reason that worked was because it was a rivalry. Now, if we're staying on the topic of rivalries, what is the biggest rivalry right now in the welterweight division? It's Colby Covington versus Ian Garry, and that's exactly what I'm choosing for a non-title fight pay-per-view main event. I know people have quite a bitter taste in the mouth when it comes to Colby Covington main eventing pay-per-views after he just main evented UFC 296. But I feel like this fight has something about it. I mean, the build-up would be one of the best, probably the best build-up on this entire list. Covington and Garry have I'd go as far to say the biggest, or at least one of the biggest rivalries in the UFC right now. You've got undefeated striker in Ian Garry versus Covington, who's been at the top of the welterweight division for the longest time. This could definitely go as a main event for a pay-per-view. And I don't care if you're, like, everyone would rather see Covington and Ian Garry main event a pay-per-view than Pantoja. No disrespect to Pantoja, he's a dominant champion, but I would much rather see Covington versus Garry as a main event. As long as they've got like a stacked prelim and stacked undercard, I don't care. Covington versus Garry, in my opinion, would be the biggest one you can make in the welterweight division as of right now, just because of the rivalry that it would use to generate sales for that fight. And then the lightweight division is pretty easy. Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler, do I need to explain? And I know they were booked to fight at 170, but listen, they could easily fight at 155 as long as McGregor just, stops injecting needles into himself and cuts down a bit of weight. McGregor versus Chandler, this doesn't need much explanation. You've got the biggest star in the UFC, a fight that we've been waiting for ages. McGregor Chandler, lightweight division, the biggest fight you can make. Let's move on. Featherweight division. Now, for the featherweight division, it has to include Volkanovski. I mean, the dude is one of the greatest featherweights of all time. He's had the belt for so long, and in my opinion, if you take away Topuria, he is by far the biggest star in the featherweight division, and I think he could definitely get away with main event in a non-title fight main event. And I would put him against Aljamain Sterling. A year ago, both of these guys were defending champions. They've both been knocked out. Obviously, Sterling's now moved up to 145 after a beat Calvin Kattar at UFC 300. So Sterling versus Volkanovski, I think that's a really interesting fight. And like I said, a year ago, they were both champions. And I know that's not the same case now, but I still think that's a really big fight and probably the biggest fight you can make at 145 if you take away the belts. Like I said, Max Holloway's the BMF champion, so we can't include Max Holloway in this. So I'm going to do Volkanovski versus Sterling. And you know what? I wouldn't even mind if this got announced soon, because even though people are going to complain about the fact that Volkanovski's coming back too soon or whatever, you really think Volkanovski's getting stopped by Aljamain Sterling? Really? You think Aljamain Sterling's putting Volkanovski's lights out? I don't think he does at all. So Volkanovski versus Sterling, in my opinion, would be the biggest non-title fight pay-per-view main event you can make in the featherweight division. Bantamweight was the toughest in my opinion, because you take away Sean O'Malley, and who the hell is main eventing a pay-per-view in this division? It's a really good division. It's so competitive, but star power wise, who is main eventing a pay-per-view? I would have said Merab versus Cejudo if they hadn't fought each other already, because Cejudo's, he's got this resume behind him, and I think the build-up would be fun. But right now, I guess I've got to go with Merab and Marlon Vera. Now I know people are going to call Merab boring or whatever. I don't think he's that boring. His performance against Yan and his performance against Cejudo, he just effortlessly ragdolled him. It was fun. I guess his fight with Aldo was boring, but he's facing Vera, who has just main evented a pay-per-view, and I think if they promote it correctly, which Merab would definitely do, because Merab knows how to promote a fight, I think you can do that. It's a classic striker versus grappler, and let's be honest, even though this is a really weak pay-per-view main event, and this has this has featured fights screamed all over it, I'm going to have to do Merab versus Vera, because genuinely, who else is there? We can't include Cejudo, the dude's on a 2-fight losing streak and he's already faced Merab. Uman and Magomedov, I guess you can get the Dagestani fan base tapped in, but the dude's not even ranked in the top 10 yet. Sandhagen just doesn't scream superstar just yet. It's got to be Vera versus Merab, in my opinion, for the bantamweight division. And then flyweight. Now, flyweight, you've got to be really careful, because I would argue that even Pantoja, as I said before, is a really weak pay-per-view main event, and he's the champion. So what are we going to do about this dead division? Now, in my opinion, if you're going to do any flyweights, let's keep Brandon Moreno away from it with all due respect. Let's keep Brandon Royval away from it with all due respect. Let's do Manel Kape versus Kai Kara-France, because let's be honest, no one else cares about, like, if you do Moreno versus Royval 3 as a pay-per-view main event, no one's watching that. Like, no casual fan is watching that, let's be completely honest. It has to be a fight that's going to get the casuals involved if it's a pay-per-view main event. And that is why I've done Manel Kape versus Kai Kara-France, the biggest rivalry in that division. Do multiple press conferences. Let Manel Kape get as much mic time as possible. This dude would help promote the fight. It's a big rivalry. You've got the whole City kickboxing team with Kai Kara-France. It's a fight that I'd actually love to see. I think this would stylistically be a really fun fight. You can also promote it, and I know Manel Kape's booked against Makaev or whatever, but you can also report it as like a #1 contender fight. The winner gets a title shot against Pantoja. So for the flyweight division, in what is a relatively dead division, if you want to get the casuals involved and you want to get people generated, well, you want to get interest generated into this fight, I don't think there's any fight you can make other than Manel Kape versus Kai Kara-France. So that is the biggest non-title fight pay-per-view main event I would personally do in every single weight class in the UFC. Let me know what you would do if you had the choice. But yeah, that's my list. Let me know your thoughts on it. Thank you for watching.